Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me today, I have not one, but two amazing colleagues, Dan Welch and Kevin Pawlak. Hello, fellas. How you doing tonight?
Doing well, Chris.
Great, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. Now, the reason I asked Dan and Kevin to come here this evening is I'm at our 8th annual Emerging Civil War Symposium at Stevenson Ridge. We got into a discussion about the Antietam campaign. And as part of that, John Pope kept popping his head up in sort of whack-a-mole fashion. And there just got to be a lot of trash talk about John Pope. And a lot of it centered between Dan and Kevin. And so this could be a meeting of the John Pope fan club, or it could be a meeting of the Fitz John Porter fan club. We're going to see how tonight's conversation goes. So, Kevin, let me ask you first: are you Team Porter or Team Pope here?
Oh gosh, you're gonna make me tip my hand early. I'd have to say overall Team Porter, though. I don't. I think John Pope has his uses.
He has his uses. He's like a tool. He can be used. He's like not independent on his own. He's just a tool.
No, I think maybe uses isn't the right way of putting it, but I think there are some strengths and weaknesses to John Pope. He has his good days and bad days, just like any Civil War commander. But
Okay.
It's always fun to rib Dan a little bit when I get the chance.
Yeah, Dan's actually nodding his head like, yes, he's got uses. Yeah. He's got strengths. Dan, I'm assuming you're Team Pope.
Yeah, I completely agree with Kevin. When you really start looking at these leaders, these generals, these officers during the Civil War, they all have good days. They all have bad days. Most are remembered for their good days, and their bad days are forgotten. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find, some folks today realize that Robert E. Lee lost the Battle of Gettysburg. That would surprise some folks. But I think that Pope has been remembered for his bad day and not all of his good days. And his influence not only on this time period, end of August, beginning of September of 1862, but throughout the Civil War is incredibly profound. And he had his uses. He understood his strengths. He was vetoed when he protested against the Peter Principle, being promoted to your highest level of failure. So it's kind of become a joke between Kevin and I, but it's definitely something that both of us have really rooted in some really intense historical research over the last year or two.
Research that, as I understand, has taken place over cigars and beer.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. Cigars and beers. And more often than not, accompanied with some fried pickles and some wings. So, wherever you can find all of those things in one establishment, may be where these conversations are taking place.
As soon as you said wings, Kevin, being a Western New Yorker, is like, yes,
I've been craving them for the last few days. It's been a couple days since I've had them, so it's starting to restart the cycle, I guess.
I'm surprised they're not still working their way through.
Yeah, I guess not.
That happens with me. So you guys both talk about Pope having some strengths and some weaknesses. Just in a couple quick words, what would each of you say would be some of Pope's strengths and some of his weaknesses?
I think Pope is one of his strengths is he's really good at analysis, and he's really good at making strong, confident decisions. Even when those around him may not be comfortable with those decisions, he will carry them forward because he's a man that's rooted in his convictions. And when he's rooted in a conviction that he is right on a particular subject or topic at hand, he's going to pursue it to the nth degree. So I definitely think that's some of his strengths. In addition to that, he will prove to be an incredibly competent administrator on the back end of the Civil War, which I think is another really good strength of Pope. And the last thing I will point out is Pope's also a really good tactician and strategist. He does have his bad days, but as renowned Maryland campaign historian Joseph Harsh argues in his book Confederate Tide Rising, Pope has bested Lee at every turn in July and August of 1862 until 1 o'clock on August the 30th. So Pope also gets some strengths in strategy and tactics as well.
it's all good till it's not.
Yeah.
Kevin, what do you think? What's your assessment of John Pope here?
I think sort of along the lines of what Dan said, he's a headstrong guy, and I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. That I think has been used to throw Pope in a bad light at times with him being so focused. I'm sure we'll get into it, but on August 27th, 28th, 29th, even the 30th at Second Manassas, of being so focused on just Jackson's portion of Lee's army that ultimately leads to Pope's demise. But I think too, you when you look at when John Pope first comes east and he starts issuing some of these general orders and he issues the famous address to his soldiers on July 14th as well. It really, I think, lifts the morale of a lot of the soldiers underneath his command because they need a commander like that. And, I've never served in the military, but having talked with people in the military, they say you don't want a guy that doesn't have confidence in himself commanding you on a battlefield, because that's never going to end well. You want somebody that has a little bit of fire in the belly and ambition amongst themselves to be leading your troops into battle. And John Pope certainly was that. He definitely believed in himself, definitely believed in what he was doing, the cause that he was fighting for. And, ultimately, of course, it didn't pan out. I think one of Pope's biggest weaknesses in my studying of the Army of Virginia and the transition time period between the Second Manassas and Maryland campaign is I don't think Pope is a very good supply officer. Now, of course, as an Army commander, you could argue maybe that's not his full job, and it's certainly not, but he has a lot of things on his plate, as any Army commander does. And if you look at the Army of Virginia throughout mid to late August of 1862, I mean, it's just falling apart at the seams in terms of the supply issues that it's having. Soldiers talk about not having been issued rations for 3 or 4 days. Pope's cavalry fails him, and a lot of the reason for that is he's not able to get enough forage out to his horses, and his horses have been run pretty rough over central Virginia for the last few weeks prior to that as well. But I think that really starts to impact Pope's army and how it operates and how well it can operate, how efficient it is during the later stages of the Second Manassas campaign.
Kevin raises.
I think. Oh, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, Kevin raises two really good points, and I think that's why it's so important to have these kind of historical discussions with colleagues in the field. As he was talking about one of strengths of Pope's strengths, Kevin was talking about the ability to inspire men. You gotta remember that the Union war effort is just coming off of the Peninsula Campaign, the 7 Days battles. These guys have been sitting after that down there on the Virginia Peninsula. The Army of Virginia is going to be comprised of soldiers that had been soundly defeated by Jackson in the spring of 1862 in the Valley Campaign. It's curious how Hooker gets a lot of attention historically on boosting the morale of the Army of the Potomac after Burnside, and particularly after Fredericksburg in the Mud March. But we don't look at Pope in that same vein as someone that comes in and inspires confidence. And the primary sources bear it out. The men in the ranks really feel that conviction, that strong-headedness, that belief in himself that Kevin talked about, and it really lifts the morale of both the Army of Virginia as well as the units of the AOP that will eventually join the Army of Virginia on the plains of Manassas. I will come to Kevin's weakness of Pope, and I wholeheartedly agree that Pope struggles in logistics. He is not a logistician.
You just wanted to use the word logistician, I think.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I mean, who doesn't like using that word? I mean, now if I could only spell it, that would be something completely different. But, one of the first things that Pope does, he makes a huge blunder and he fires Herman Haupt, who is the railroad guy of not only the Army of the Potomac because of their operations, their theater of operations, but this is a former railroad guy. He understands track gauges and switching and loading and unloading and timetables and on and on and on. And with the loss of Haupt, it sets logistics and resupply back by weeks. You couple that with the situation that Pope has inherited. When he's corresponding with the new commanders of the Army of Virginia after it's created. And even before that, receiving some of the intelligence on those units, those men, those individual independent commands, which are now being comprised of the Army of Virginia, have absolutely been through the ringer in the Shenandoah Valley campaign of 62 against Jackson. A lot of their supplies were captured. A lot of supplies were left behind. A lot of things were destroyed. And since that time, those requisitions by their commanding officers have not been being filled adequately or timely. So we get into a situation where his army is already behind the 8 ball supply wise, which does damage morale and also damages your effectiveness as a fighting force. And then you couple that with a weakness of Pope as not being the greatest logistician out there in the Union Army. And it's going to set up a number of challenges, as Kevin talked about, men that are, talk about not getting rations for 4 and 5 days, marching through uniforms, no tents, no blankets, as the weather will turn quite quickly into very low temperatured evenings in September leading up into the Maryland campaign. So definitely a weakness.
And when you guys talk about his inability to pay attention to his logistics, and I think that is borne out quite dramatically when Stonewall Jackson swoops into Manassas Junction and has this carnival of chaos, wrecking all those supplies. And if Pope had been paying closer attention to those supplies, they probably would not have been concentrated like they would, or as vulnerable as they were, because he'd have had his mind on them a little bit more.
Even before that, I think the Confederate Stewart's raid at Catlet Station, an immense amount of stores is captured and destroyed at Catlet as well. So you're right. There seems to be, and this could be part of that, Star Wars force sensitive, adage of, your overconfidence is your weakness. I think that Pope's push south in July of 62 towards Gordonsville and towards an important logistical supply hub for Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, I think that confidence in his drive south has left the vulnerability of his supply lines and his lack of operating them at an efficient level, a glaring omission in his performance during the Second Manassas campaign.
So we've talked a bit about Pope, but one of the things that fascinates me kind of about this late April into mid-September period, late August into mid-September period, is we've got a lot of really forceful personalities, Pope being one of them. And I suppose the other one we really need to hold up would be George McClellan. And, how would you guys weigh McClellan's influence on these events as they begin to unfold during this time period?
I'll start, Kevin, and then I'll let Kevin pick up. I'm going to start with even before we get to the end of August. When Pope is brought east and he's given this command, which, by the way, he refuses this command on 3 separate occasions, which a lot of folks don't play into their understanding of his performance. He had all this army and the AOP and all this stuff, and he just was an incompetent commander. He recognized, as I talked about, one of his strengths, he recognized through a very thorough analysis of the units comprising and the commanders comprising the Army of Virginia, that he was not going to be able to accomplish what Washington and Lincoln wanted with what he was given, and that's why he refuses command. But once he does take command, he very quickly tries to work with McClellan in a congenial manner, but it becomes pretty evident in a short period of time that Pope is not going to get any willing cooperation out of McClellan anytime soon. And what you see is a decline in Pope's direct correspondence with McClellan, which he begins in late June and early July of 62, to Pope then going to Halleck, which Halleck, by the way, is part of a bargain that Pope works with Lincoln and the Lincoln administration. If I can't say no to being in command of this new army, you've got to bring Halleck east to be my boss. That's how we get Halleck out in the Eastern Theater. So Pope stops.
Great move that turned out to be.
Yeah, great move that turned out to be. But really, so Pope, as June turns into July and July moves towards August, that communication, that direct correspondence with McClellan, his willingness to try to work with McClellan quickly wanes, and you see Pope going to Halleck. The problem with that, and this will set up this Pope-McClellan relationship, if you want to call it, is that Halleck becomes very two-sided in his correspondence to his two commanders.
Oh, don't see that from Halleck at all either.
Don't see that from Halleck at all. Pope will tell Halleck, here's what I need McClellan to do, and Halleck will say, absolutely, we're going to get him to do it. And Halleck will immediately get in contact with McClellan and say, this is what Pope wants. McClellan says, I can't do it. Halleck says, well, that seems like perfect sense to me. And then Halleck will wire Pope back and say, yeah, McClellan's going to do exactly what you want. So it's really setting up a very awkward situation between these two dominant forces in the Eastern theater in August and September. And I'll let Kevin pick up to that moment, because I have heard Kevin tell this story at the Ox Hill battlefield, and it, not blowing smoke, Kevin, this actually, gave me chills when you talk about the moment of McClellan riding out and meeting Pope. So if you want to pick that up in the post Second Manassas and Pope arriving back to Centerville. And
let me just add one quick thing here, because since you're talking about that period from late June and early July, and of course McClellan's getting his butt handed to him in the 7 days during that, so that doesn't put him in a happy mood, and he's bitter about being replaced as general-in-chief of the army by Halleck. So we've got these sorts of dynamics playing into this relationship too that you mentioned. Kevin, let's hear this story, pal.
If I could, I want to rewind a bit before September 2nd of 1862 with that, and just talk a little bit more about the McClellan, Halleck, Pope dynamic. Chris, you had asked about McClellan's weight, so to speak, at this point in terms of dictating Union policy. Of course, it's waned quite a bit. If you look at the fall of 1861, when McClellan is called east, just as Pope is in the summer of 1862, Lincoln and the federal authorities bow a lot to what McClellan wants to do. McClellan wanting to, turn volunteers into a professional army, take plenty of time, and constantly Lincoln bows to that, bows to McClellan and allows McClellan to do that. No longer is that going to be the case by early July of 1862. McClellan, of course, wants to remain down on the Virginia Peninsula with his army, be reinforced and drive, if not towards Richmond, at least drive on Petersburg and try to sever the connection to Richmond from the south, which of course is something that Grant's going to do in the spring of 1864 ultimately. But McClellan no longer carries the weight that he once did for all sorts of reasons. He's no longer general-in-chief. Of course, June 27th, actually, I think early morning hours of June 28th, he'll write to Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, that you've done your best to sacrifice this army. So McClellan's not winning any favors, certainly between Lincoln and Stanton with words like that. But McClellan's now not the only chess player on the board for the Union Army in the Eastern Theater. He's no longer one controlling this huge, overwhelming Union Army, because now those three Union armies in the Shenandoah Valley have come together under John Pope. And of course, one thing we failed to mention so far is Pope is a Republican and McClellan's a Democrat. And certainly that has weight too. But when you look at I absolutely agree with everything Dan said about Halleck being two-sided. When Halleck starts putting together and orchestrating, if you want to use that word for him, orchestrating, what I think he does very poorly, orchestrating the concentration of the Army of Virginia, and the Army of the Potomac, Pope is basically wondering, well, what's my place going to be in all of this? And Halleck says, you'll be in command of these two armies once they're combined. And McClellan asks the same thing of Halleck, and Halleck turns around to McClellan and says, well, you'll be in command when these two armies are combined. And so both commanders are being fed lies, essentially by Halleck, which isn't helping the situation at all. And this is just going to continue to then, once these two armies come closer together, breed contempt between the two men. And it was contempt that had really begun from before Pope even came east. In May of 1862, when Fitz John Porter, one of whom Lincoln calls McClellan's pets, and of course somebody that's going to have quite a few run-ins with John Pope over his lifetime, when Porter is promoted to Major General, he's promoted over Pope, and Pope wrote a letter in middle of May 1862 to Stanton and Lincoln protesting this, that Porter was promoted above him and other junior officers were promoted above Pope. And when Pope comes east, July 8th, I believe, he writes a letter to one of Lincoln's cabinet members saying basically McClellan should be court-martialed because he doesn't believe McClellan is going to move fast enough to get off the peninsula and join Pope's army in Northern Virginia. And of course, McClellan and what's that?
And I agree with that.
Well, and of course, McClellan and Pope are writing, I think pretty cordial letters to each other publicly in
Yes.
professional military correspondence, but
Yes.
privately, they're not saying good things about each other at all. And I don't think either one is, in my opinion, I don't think either one is purposefully trying to undermine the other, but that really puts each of those two men rooted deeply in their own beliefs and their own strategy, that they're right and the other person is wrong. And that they're going to fight even harder for their strategy as compared to the other person's. And that all comes to a head, of course, late August of 62, when the concentration of the armies does begin. And McClellan's army is moving off the peninsula to first Aquia Creek and then Alexandria, ultimately, to join Pope's army. But all of that really comes to a head, September 2nd of 1862, when Pope is exhausted. He's dirty. His uniform is a mess. He's riding east with the Army of Virginia in just shambles, in no shape to fight a battle at the moment. Men are hardly marching in formation back into the defenses of Washington. And Pope comes riding up Upton's Hill in the area of Seven Corners today, near what was Fort Buffalo. Unfortunately, the fort no longer stands today. But who does he see riding out from behind Fort Buffalo to greet him on September 2nd, 1862, is George Brinton McClellan, who's dressed in an immaculate uniform with a large staff of officers behind him. McClellan even has his yellow sash draped around his chest. And, here comes Pope riding up to McClellan, I'm sure very sheepishly. And McClellan says that your forces are now under my command. And McClellan is now the one giving orders to Pope to, about where his troops are going to go. And so it ultimately comes down to McClellan winning out on top. I don't know if you'd necessarily say he won out, but I guess he just survived the longest in late August and early September of 1862. But, even then, Pope and McClellan go at each other for the rest of their lives. Pope always blaming McClellan for not getting the reinforcements that he believed he would at Second Manassas, that Pope believed would have pushed the Federal Army to victory there in late August of 1862. And of course, Pope also, for the rest of his life, claiming that the mind of the Army of the Potomac soldiers that were with him at Second Manassas were almost poisoned by McClellanism, to not support Pope and to not maybe fight as fervently as they would otherwise.
Now I want to get into the details of that just a little bit, but let me ask you here. So if Pope is riding into DC following this defeat at Second Manassas, if he's riding in as victor, is he taking orders from McClellan, or is McClellan going to be taking orders from him?
So I think it goes back to the question that you had asked, Chris, about the weight of McClellan during this time period, or differently phrased, the influence or impact that McClellan has in the Eastern Theater at this point in time. And as Kevin was talking a little bit about that, I really think that not only has McClellan's weight or influence diminished significantly, just, if you look at the stripping of his command responsibilities while he's on the peninsula, I don't think that either Pope or McClellan have much impact, influence, or weight during this time. And in my historical opinion, and the research that I've done, is I really feel that it is Stanton, the War Department, and Lincoln that have the most weight in the outcome and influence of military events taking place in August of 1862. We talk a lot about, Lincoln and Stanton trying to run the events in the Shenandoah Valley in the spring of 1862. And for lack of a unified command, a lack of a Halleck, or a lack of a person as general in chief. And Stanton even talks to this when Pope comes east. Stanton, one of the meetings that Pope has with Stanton tells Pope, listen, Lincoln and I tried to run this thing out in the Shenandoah Valley in the spring, and it was a disaster. I mean, we just got, not only did our units get handed to us, but this was a huge learning curve for both myself and Lincoln, and we need somebody with experience. And it's one of the reasons why we're calling you out here. But the reason I say that Pope nor McClellan have a lot of weight or influence or impact at this point in time is because there is strong evidence that the edict that Pope sends out to his army, the famous words of, we're not going to talk about lines of retreat, or, the enemy's no longer going to see our backs. And the general orders that Pope follows up over the next week and a half, the next 10 days or so, in July of 1862, there is strong evidence that those orders were either not written by Pope or they were dictated to him from Lincoln and Stanton. That it was Lincoln and Stanton that were looking to take the war in a completely different direction that McClellan had prosecuted it thus far. The McClellanism approach to war, and Kevin can get into that. But that these orders and this edict to his men, if they're not being dictated to him, they're coming from Lincoln and Stanton. And with the third option, which is that Pope has written them, but his superiors have read them and approved them. But I really think that we still see a heavy influence and weight from Lincoln and Stanton trying to run the show, if you will, in the Eastern theater of the war in July and August of 1862. Kevin, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I just came across a great story. It's actually in 1864 between Grant, Stanton, and Lincoln, excuse me, when Grant is asking to have a lot of the heavy artillery units pulled out of the defenses of Washington, and Stanton utterly refuses, to the point where, according to John Rawlins, who tells the story to an author that publishes it in the 1890s, I believe, Grant and Stanton get into a little bit of a verbal, I wouldn't say argument, but it's an elevated discussion over what to do about this, and they finally agree to go talk to Lincoln in person about this. And Lincoln says something to Stanton of, to the effect, we tried running this war once and it didn't work out too well for us, so I think we should listen to Grant. Basically, we brought him east to figure all this out, and I think that bears out exactly what you're saying, Dan. That Lincoln and Stanton had tried to run the war. They were still trying to run the war in the summer of 1862, and I think did not do a good job at it. And Lincoln finally recognized that. One thing with Pope, Chris, you had asked about, could Pope have been riding into Washington as the victor in September of 1862? I wouldn't say he'd be riding into Washington as the victor, at least in terms of victor on a battlefield. But I think he could have been riding into Washington in September of 1862 as the victor, at least between McClellan and Pope. And what I mean by that, I think going back to, this is a post I'm working on for Emerging Civil War for the Second Manassas anniversary, so stay tuned for that. But when you look at Pope in the field, when he takes the field in late July of 1862, I mean, he's basically in the field for a month from the time he leaves Washington, takes personal command of the Army of Virginia, to the time, of course, he's ultimately removed from command of the Army of Virginia in early September. And Pope's objectives change constantly. He has multiple objectives throughout the campaign. And, many commanders have multiple objectives. But what I mean is, it's not, these are your three objectives, go follow these. It's, well, today this is your objective. And then tomorrow it changes, and the next day it changes. And this is something that I think is partially Pope's fault, because Pope will change his objective multiple times, especially later on in the campaign. But this is coming from Halleck and mostly Halleck at this point. But what's interesting is at the end of the campaign, Pope's main objective is not to bring Lee's army to battle. It's to bring about the reunification of the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Virginia. And what I think is interesting, and I think speaks a lot to the personality of Pope, is Pope had the opportunity to do that. The Army of the Potomac is in Northern Virginia by, I think, the Second Corps, Sumner's Second Corps lands in Alexandria on August 29th, if I remember correctly. They don't begin marching out towards Pope immediately, which is a whole other story that we can get into. But all Pope has to do to bring about the reunification of his army is fall back behind Bull Run, and Lee couldn't get at him. And of course, Pope doesn't, because he's got that fire in the belly. He's got Jackson right in front of him. He's going to go after him, and ultimately, of course, that leads to, ironically enough, Pope's demise. But I do think if Pope had withdrawn a crossbow run the night of the 28th, maybe even the night of the 29th, before the 30th and Longstreet's assault happens to Pope's army, I think if you bring those two armies together, McClellan's not going to be handed the army again. It's going to be Pope, because Pope has done, yes, he's given up a lot of central Virginia, but he's done exactly what his objective is at this point in the campaign, is bring about the reunification of those two armies. And he could have done it. But he didn't. He was focused on Jackson on 28th, 29th, and 30th, and Pope was going to go after him no matter what. And of course, didn't withdraw a crossbow run until he was absolutely forced to, and handcuffed by Longstreet's assault on the 30th. So I think in terms of victor, at least, Pope could have been the victor in the sense of, again, claiming himself the victor over McClellan, but not necessarily over Lee.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
And before we kind of get into some of the nitty gritty about the battle itself and the controversy that erupts, let me ask you about one other parallel I see between these two commanders, and that is that they both seem to be working with corps commanders that are not of their own choosing, and they're sort of handcuffed by that. And McClellan responds by reorganizing and creating a couple new corps so that he can name some of his buddies, and that's sort of his consolation. And Pope is sort of asked to forge an army out of a bunch of B-listers who've all seen defeat. How does that affect the way they approach their command and how they kind of see their roles as leaders?
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead, Dan.
Go ahead. Yeah.
For McClellan, when his corps are created, the first 4 Army Corps of the Army of the Potomac in March of 1862, as he's embarking to go to the peninsula, McClellan and Lincoln had been debating this for quite some time, but McClellan wanted to get into battle first and see who the best battlefield commanders were before creating corps, and then appoint those men to be corps commanders. Lincoln didn't want that, and so Lincoln basically said, no, these are going to be your 4 corps commanders. And of course, he gets Irvin McDowell, Edwin Sumner, Erasmus Keyes, and Samuel Heintzelman and Erasmus Keyes, going 1, 2, 3, 4. As you alluded to, Chris, McClellan, once he gets on the peninsula in May of 62, is going to create the 5th and 6th Corps for 2 of his favorite subordinates, Porter and Franklin. That breeds, I don't know if contempt is the right word, but at least it breaks away at that trust in the relationship between Lincoln and McClellan. Now, Pope is basically given his corps commanders as well, but these guys they've been in command of corps-sized forces before. And of course, that's Fremont, who's quickly going to resign and be replaced by Sigel, Nathaniel Banks, and Irvin McDowell as well. But I think what you start to see with both McClellan and Pope when it comes to their corps commanders is that they don't trust a lot of their corps commanders. And so they don't trust them on the battlefield. They don't trust what they tell them in terms of information. Sometimes, Pope says on August 28th that he thinks Sigel is completely unreliable. And how can you have somebody carry out your plans if you don't even have trust in them to do their basic job? And I think that chips away at an army as well.
Well, and certainly Banks's performance at Cedar Mountain, does a lot to undermine Pope's confidence in his corps commanders.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, even Irvin McDowell, who by all accounts, it seems that Pope placed the most trust in McDowell, certainly as his Army of Virginia Corps commander. Yep. There are even times during the Battle of Second Manassas where Pope says things like, I can't believe, what the heck is McDowell doing? Like this damn fool. And so Pope even, his trust isn't fully in him. So again, if you can't trust the people underneath you to carry out your orders, you're probably not going to tell them exactly what your plan is, which is a problem for them to figure that out. And then also, how can you, once you have that plan, if you do tell them, how can you trust that they're going to carry it out? And that's not a good working relationship, whether you're talking about CEO of a business and his top subordinates or, an army. And both McClellan and Pope have that problem, partially of their doing and partially not of their doing. but I don't think they really do much to try and rectify or make that situation any better with their own commanders.
So Pope he's straddled with his corps commanders, much like he inherits what becomes the Army of Virginia and all the problems that come along with it, that he doesn't have a lot of control over. He doesn't have a lot of control over or influence in the ability to be able to replace his commanders, particularly a guy like Franz Sigel. Siegel's notoriety and celebrity within the German American population, the political support that Siegel's notoriety and celebrity brings to the Republican Party and to the Lincoln administration, there's no way that he's going to be able to can Sigel and find somebody more important. Banks's performance at Cedar Mountain, isn't the greatest performance, but it's also not Jackson's greatest performance either that day at all. So, as Kevin mentioned, Pope scratching his head about Banks. And the most surprising thing is that as Pope's tenure continues and we get closer and closer to the battle, or what would become the Battle of Second Manassas, the closer that Pope and McDowell get. And it's one of those things that I have not been able to fully flesh out an analysis on why McDowell's decisions, McDowell's influence, McDowell's advice weighs so heavily with Pope. And then Kevin talks about, that these moments during the Battle of Second Manassas where Pope's like, oh my God, McDowell's a damn fool. And you read the correspondence and the influence McDowell's had on Pope for the last 2-3 weeks at this point. And you're like, well, how did he not recognize that in McDowell? But then, again, we talk about good days and bad days. When Pope will order Porter's men forward at 1:00 on August 30th, and has been ignoring all intelligence that Longstreet is on the field since the 29th. And Longstreet launches his assault and it wipes the Union defenders off Chin Ridge. Longstreet's last 2-3 fresh brigades left to be put in are hitting the Sudley Road. They're getting ready to push on to Henry House Hill. It's McDowell that has a good moment and saves Pope's army from absolute utter destruction and buys time for Pope's army to retreat, over the Bull Run Bridge and off towards Centerville on the Warrenton Turnpike. So it's really interesting. I think there's a lot of politics involved with the Army of the Potomac, obviously, but the Army of Virginia as well. I think Pope is saddled with the corps commanders he has. He's struggling to get these guys, the Army of Virginia, to get them new uniforms and food. There's no way he's fighting a war. He just lost a war against Lincoln and Stanton to command this army. He wants nothing to do with it. And now he's not going to win being able to really handpick who he wants to command these disparate former armies, which are now lumped together into the Army of Virginia.
And Dan, you touched on something that really sort of gets to the nub of our story tonight when you talk about Porter finally getting ordered in, and we're talking here about the mistrust that Pope and McClellan have with their own corps commanders, with their own command structure, with each other, the politics that are all involved. And so this is all the context for the arrival of Fitz John Porter onto the field, and he gets sent in, and all hell breaks loose in the worst sorts of ways, centered around Porter. When do you want to walk us kind of through what actually happens and what the ramifications of that turn out to be?
I'll turn it over to Kevin, but I'm going to lead off with a very simple phrase. It was a perfect storm. Everything that we've talked about so far, the politics, the command structure, the command relationships with Washington, with each other, between Pope and McClellan, all of that, and Pope's own personality. And in this moment, I really liken Pope to a Hooker at Chancellorsville. Hooker's campaign, the Chancellorsville campaign, is excellent until the battle begins. And Hooker becomes very myopic. He reverts back to not even a corps commander, but a division commander. He almost acts like a division commander. And I think this is Pope. Pope is no longer an army commander, particularly by the afternoon of the 29th, but more specifically on the 30th as it relates to Porter. He becomes very myopic and focused on one thing, and just he can't let go. And it's all this perfect storm of events that will tie into Porter. So Kevin, I turn it over to you.
Wait. I got to stop just because you say the phrase a perfect storm. Now I think of John Pope driving a boat as George Clooney up a wave that's like so straight up and it's going to wash him right over. And so now George Clooney is John Pope. That's terrible.
Yeah,
So Kevin, go ahead.
And how is that ship not going to sink, right?
Oh, it's going down at this
Yeah,
point.
It's going
Yeah,
down.
going down fast.
At 1 p.m., the bilge pumps have stopped working at 1 p.m. on August 30th. There is no saving this boat.
Mark Wahlberg as Fitz John Porter. I think
You're right.
Wow, we got a biopic here. William Marvel's book. All right.
I'd probably more go with Donnie Wahlberg than Marky Mark, but this isn't a high budget film. We can't.
Mark's got more of the
Marky
Fitz
Mark.
John Porter hair, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gosh, Porter and Pope, where to begin? Where to end with it? As I mentioned, I mean, they had come across each other at West Point in the old Army. When really the first run-in they have during the Civil War is not even in person. It's again when Porter's promoted to Major General over Pope, and Pope raises a stink about it. And I don't know how much that sits with Pope, at least personally, as an animus towards Porter. I don't think much. I think these guys were, it mattered to them certainly, but I don't think Pope held on to that. It's not like it was really Porter's fault that he was promoted to Major General. He didn't make that decision. Lincoln did ultimately, and that's what Pope says. But when Pope comes east, Porter immediately starts to say how he feels, and that's, I think, what ultimately leads to the downfall of Fitz John Porter is he doesn't know how to put a cap on it in terms of what he says. He just goes out there and put it in modern terms, he just tweets what he feels. And that gets him in trouble. I mean, he refers, he says something along the lines of, I understand that Pope, who's now come east, is not is still in his old army ways, an ass. That last part's a quote, those last two words. But despite that, Porter does, to his credit, write a private letter to a friend of his in early August of 1862 before he's ordered to join Pope. And he says basically, look, I don't care who I'm under, if it's Pope or McClellan. Porter does say he prefers McClellan, of course, but he really says, like, I just want this thing to be over with. Let's just do our jobs and get this thing over with. And then, of course, when Porter does come east, and I will say Porter's Corps is the first corps, whether by McClellan's design or just by happenstance, Porter's Corps is the first corps ordered away from Harrison's Landing. And Porter marches fast. He marches 16 miles the first day to get back on the boats to go and join Pope. So he's not dragging his feet to go and support Pope at all. But when Porter's Fifth Corps disembarks at Aquia Creek on August 22nd, he's ordered to march up towards Kelly's Ford, which is the left end of Pope's line along the Rappahannock River. And Porter gets there and Pope's army is gone. And Porter's stuck looking around, wondering where is Pope? Because Pope hasn't left him any orders or left him any information about where he's gone. And so that rankles Porter a little bit. And Porter he's maintaining the direct telegraph line back to Fredericksburg with Ambrose Burnside. And Porter starts venting to Burnside, saying, things are at 6s and 7s here. Strategy and tactics are in the inverse as compared to what the enemy is doing. I hope McClellan will get here soon, different things like that. And Burnside is just forwarding these up the chain of command to Halleck and ultimately to Stanton and Lincoln because Lincoln, Stanton, and Halleck are craving any information because they don't know where Pope is either. And so Burnside is just sending all this up. And of course, that's ultimately going to get Porter in trouble. But what really starts it between Pope and Porter is the night of August 27th. Following Pope's push up the Orange and Alexandria Railroad to try and ensnare Jackson around Manassas Junction, the right column of Pope's three-pronged approach towards Manassas Junction is under the command of Joe Hooker. It's just a division of about 5,000 men. And they fight a severe battle at Bristow Station on August 27th, the afternoon. And as that battle comes to an end, John Pope rides up to the field and finds that Hooker's command is in rough shape. He learns from a couple of captured Confederate prisoners that Jackson's entire force of 25,000 men is in front of Hooker. And so Pope immediately sends a courier back to Porter saying, move your men, start marching your men towards Bristow Station at 1 a.m. the morning of August 28th, so that they get here by dawn. Porter reads this. He calls together a council of war of his subordinate officers and says, we can't march on these roads. It's full of wagons. It's so dark. We can't see anything. We can't march on these roads at 1 a.m. It wouldn't matter if we started marching at 1 a.m. or if we started marching at dawn. We'll probably get to Bristow about the same time. So Porter waited. He waited until the sun rose on the 28th. When Pope wakes up on the morning of the 28th, Porter's not at Bristow. Porter gets to Bristow several hours later. By this time, the sun's already risen on the day. And so that rankles Pope a little bit. Fast forward to the next day, things start to get interesting when Porter's corps is ordered towards Manassas Junction. And it is placed for a time underneath the command of Irvin McDowell. And Porter and McDowell are given by Pope what comes to be known as the joint order, which is written out to both of them. McDowell is the senior commander over Porter, so it essentially places Porter under McDowell's command for a time, under his eye at least. And what it tells Porter and McDowell to do is turn their corps around, move it towards Gainesville, advance towards Gainesville. And what Pope intended the order to do was to have Porter and McDowell's troops get in a position to strike the right end of Jackson's line and split, or at least drive a wedge between Jackson's command and Longstreet's command. But the joint order is just a massive confusion. It tells Porter to, again, not to advance to Gainesville and attack the enemy. It simply says advance towards Gainesville. And then it also says we should be prepared to fall back across Bull Run this evening because of our supply situation. And then it also says, if you feel like you need to deviate from this order at all because you think that's better than what the order says, then go ahead and do it. And so it's just this order of contradictions, and Porter's just kind of left sitting there going, well, I don't know. And so as he's advancing towards Gainesville, Porter runs into the lead elements of James Longstreet's troops starting to arrive on the battlefield. Porter is convinced that the force in front of him is strong, which it was, that he's not able to attack it. McDowell goes and just rides away and takes his troops away from Porter's column, and so weakens Porter's column ultimately. And Pope is constantly sitting there waiting the whole day on the Manassas battlefield, waiting to hear the sound of Porter's guns striking Jackson's right. And he waits, and Pope continues ordering attacks against Jackson's line, the left and center of Jackson's line, and he never gets anything, never hears anything from Porter. Finally, it's not until about 4:30 that Pope will send peremptory orders to Porter saying attack. This creates all sorts of controversy because Pope believed that those orders were delivered very quickly. They were actually delivered by his son, and Pope was of the opinion that they were delivered very quickly. But as it turns out, later testimony showed it probably took about 2 hours for those orders to reach Porter. By the time they got to Porter about 6 p.m. on August 29th, Porter's looking at Longstreet in front of him. He's looking at his watch and he says, we don't have much time of daylight left. And so Porter doesn't attack. When Pope finds out about this again, he orders Porter to bring his corps immediately to the Manassas battlefield on the 30th. And we don't have to get into all the command decisions of the 30th, but eventually Porter is going to lead the largest Union attack of the battle against Jackson's position in the area of the Deep Cut along the unfinished railroad. And Porter's corps is going to be repulsed. They suffer pretty heavy casualties in the fighting. It's a fascinating part of the Battle of Second Manassas, in my opinion. But ultimately, then Porter is going to be, Pope's army is going to be driven back across Bull Run, and Pope's going to be looking for scapegoats. Almost immediately, he'll write a letter to Halleck and Stanton and Lincoln, and saying basically that, some of these officers of the Army of the Potomac have failed him. He cites Fitz John Porter in his initial after-action report of the campaign that he published in the papers that Lincoln didn't want him to publish in the papers. So it's just we're talking about a perfect storm with the command of these two armies, but it's a perfect storm again for Porter, because he's a McClellan disciple. I wouldn't say he's so strong as a disciple, but he's associated strongly with McClellan. Porter has been vocal about his beliefs in how the federal war effort should be carried out, and those beliefs don't align with Pope. And then also you have the problem of, Pope is looking for a scapegoat. Everybody's looking for a scapegoat. McClellan is not untouchable at this point, but he's very hard to touch in September and October and even into early November of 1862. And so Porter really becomes the fall man for all of that. And January 21st, 1863, after it's not maybe so much a kangaroo court, but it's heavily rigged against Porter. Porter is court-martialed from the Army. He's going to spend the next 24 years of his life, rather, trying to rectify that. And eventually he does. He'll get his name cleared, and he is put back on the rolls of the Army before he retires 2 days later and gets those benefits. But it's just talk about, wading into crap up to your neck in terms of this political mudslinging. Going back and forth between the two sides, and Pope gets caught in the middle of it. McClellan gets caught in the middle of it. Porter gets caught in the middle of it. And to me, that's what's so interesting about this time period is, sometimes during the war, you can separate military campaigns from politics and what's going on. But all of this is serving as is just a shadow over everybody, a huge shadow over everybody. Henry Halleck I've found 3 different occasions where Henry Halleck tells somebody, basically, we're going to have to chop off your heads if you don't behave and if you don't follow orders. Like, what a rip-rousing speech to go send your troops out onto the field of battle to, you got your boss is looking over your shoulder and he's ready to chop my head off if I don't do what I'm supposed to do. It's just a bad situation all around, and Porter gets caught up in the middle of it. I think wrongly. I don't think Porter is Porter's not perfect in this either.
This is what happens to traitors that commit treasons against the Union war effort. You get cashiered from the Army, and you do the crime, you do the time, Kevin.
I don't think
that's a good amount of time.
Now, Porter is not a traitor. Pope's not a traitor. McClellan's not a traitor. I think what the crux of Porter's court-martial is does his personal views of Pope limit his efficiency on a battlefield?
Correct. That is what the trial comes down to.
Yes. And ultimately, in my opinion, no, it does not. Porter is right out there on the front lines having bullets zing by his head. He's not cowering in the back, holding back because, I hate John Pope and I want to see him fail. He's cowering back because
he's got Longstreet's entire orders that he has.
Yeah, because Longstreet's in front of him. The orders that he has are confusing, and he doesn't know what to do at this point too. And I'm sure he has to be aware. Everybody's aware at this point of the changing war effort and what Stanton and Lincoln are doing. Porter is the highest profile officer to be court-martialed during the war, but he's certainly not the only officer to be removed outright from command. This is something that Lincoln and Stanton have been doing all summer of 1862. Mm-hmm. And everybody's aware of it, I think. And that doesn't breed a good situation, a good working environment, if you will, for any of the Union armies, but especially Union armies in the Eastern Theater of the war.
And so the ramifications. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I was going to say, and Kevin and I have had a great time with these discussions, and we turn it into some lighthearted jest, at this year's symposium and the past symposium. But Kevin's analysis is spot on, and I completely agree. It reminds me of the moment in Never-Ending Story where one of the main characters rides the horse into the swamp, and the horse drowns in the swamp, and Kevin was talking about being up to their necks in mud and mire and muck. Everybody is sinking in this swamp at this moment in time. Lincoln and Stanton's meddling is sinking everyone. Halleck's duplicity is sinking everyone. Pope and McClellan's relationship with each other, with Halleck, with Lincoln and Stanton, is sinking everybody. And what often gets lost in this conversation, and even into the point where Kevin and I jest about it, what often gets lost is the consequences of this are casualties on the battlefield for privates in the ranks in the Army of Virginia and the Army of the Potomac. These are casualties that are immense in number. We talked a little bit about Pope's lack of logistics. Um, you know, Wounded from the AOP and Army of Northern Virginia are still laying on the battlefield of Second Manassas 6 days after the battle's over. There are still 600 men of these two armies still laying on Henry House Hill. When Stanton finally had enough and ordering local hacks in DC to go out and pick these guys up, do something about this. It's making the administration look terrible, which I think ties into the Maryland campaign. There's so much riding on this next campaign. One of the things that's often talked about is foreign intervention. This is not a good show for the Union cause and the federal government. All around, this quagmire is taking everybody down with it. And it's not a good show as we move into September 2nd and McClellan, riding out to meet Pope. And let's face it, I mean, I can understand why people are McClellan fans. I mean, Pope doesn't have no yellow sash and no cape and no large cadre of officers. They've all had to stay behind in the West. I can understand why
McClellan's got an Ohioan with him too, Jacob Cox. That had to have made a difference, I'm sure.
Well, Ohioans will have a tendency to, raise the performance of everybody around them. It's just something we do. We mantle and shoulder that responsibility.
I'm going to actually ask you about Ohioans in just a second. But as we're talking about these consequences, and I think about this whole situation you guys have described as curdling. And in the meantime, like Robert E. Lee picks up his army and starts north, and so there's suddenly this urgency about all of everything too. So what are the immediate consequences in the face of Lee's invasion north? And you've got all of this quagmire happening.
Well, Lee becomes a victim of his own success at this point. When the campaign starts, Lee has a very precarious situation. Lee has McClellan bottled up on the peninsula, but for how long is he being reinforced? He's got reports of Burnside coming in and going to disembark at Fredericksburg. And he's got Pope's army driving southward and to the west, out towards Gordonsville, to really cut off Lee's link with the Shenandoah Valley, the breadbasket of the Confederacy, horses, supplies, food, communications back towards Richmond. So Lee is really trying to figure out the best course of action against these three threats. If McClellan starts moving back down the peninsula towards Richmond and Burnside's approaching from the north, heading down south from Fredericksburg, Lee's army is caught between a classic pincer movement. If Pope gets to Gordonsville and wrecks all of the rail lines and logistical lines to Lee's army, they're stuck in Richmond with few supplies and food and horses and material coming their way, and communications. So it's a catch-22 for Lee. He gambles on the idea of being able to suppress Pope quickly by sending Jackson against him, and then being able to come back to Lee's army quickly and then deal with either Burnside or McClellan. But what happens is Lee realizes that McClellan's not coming out of his position on the peninsula. He's not moving. Burnside's threat hasn't materialized yet physically. So Lee's going to gamble on moving his army out to join with Jackson and wipe Pope off the map once and for all. But with that victory and all the victories that Lee has had in this invasion northward, by the time Lee is successful at Second Manassas, tactical draw at Chantilly or Ox Hill. I don't think I've ever said that to you, Kevin. That's my opinion of that engagement. I'll be interested to see his response to that. Lee is left with little options. He can't go south. Politically, he cannot give up, and particularly his relationship with Davis would not allow him to move south and give up everything that he's captured, particularly at the high expense of the blood that he has shed since taking command in June. He can't go east. Washington, D.C. is the most heavily fortified city in the world by the summer of 1862. He can't get any closer than Centerville. And he definitely can't go west. So what's that leave him? The only option that Lee has is a victim of his own successes, that he has to push forward the invasion northwards. and move over the Potomac into Maryland, perhaps Pennsylvania. So what Lee's forced decision does then, as you're right, Chris, is it puts Washington, D.C. in this quagmire in an incredibly difficult position. The Army of Virginia has just, between Cedar Mountain, Second Manassas, and the campaign in between, they're in worse shape than they were when Pope took over. And they were already in poor shape because of what had happened in the Valley. Porter's Corps has been absolutely decimated from their assault on August the 30th against Jackson's line and places like the Deep Cut. Chantilly has taken out two very energetic and important Union officers for the Union Army. Now we've got to combine the Army of the Potomac, we've got to combine the Army of Virginia together. All the logistics have to be worked out. The command structure has to be reorganized. New recruits need to be folded in. Supplies need to be issued from top to bottom. And we have to do all this as Lee as moving north. And it puts DC under a crunch. And, are they making the best decisions? Or are they making the most expedient decisions from September 2nd moving forward?
And it seems like when they really say to McClellan, go after him, and Lincoln famously says, we've got to use the tools that we have. It's like a consolation, like it's not really his first choice, but it's his only choice because of expedience sake.
Yes.
Kevin, thoughts about that?
There's no doubt in my mind that part of the reason Lee crosses into Maryland is for political considerations. But what Lee is focused on politically is carrying out, whether Lee or not himself believes it, is up for debate, I believe. Whether or not he can bring Maryland into the folds of the Confederacy is one thing, but whether or not, Lee certainly wants to cross into Maryland to try and influence the fall upcoming elections in the northern states. Now, Robert E. Lee and his army are riding high. They're confident upon coming into Maryland. They don't have a very high opinion of their enemy. Whoever's commanding it, the soldiers that make it up, they don't have a very high opinion of McClellan. Could you imagine? I mean, Robert E. Lee was reading newspapers, certainly, and some of what Dan and I have talked about with this mess in the Union High Command was reported in the Union papers. But could you imagine if Lee could just sniff how bad this really was? I mean, how he would have just really put the pedal to the metal, really just put his foot to the throat of the Union Army at this point. And I think it probably would have raised Lee's confidence even higher. He might have tried to grasp for more than he did if he had just been aware of all of this. Of course, there was no way that he could be, but if he had, I mean, my gosh, you're looking at, Washington is a mess in early September of 1862. I mean, it's an absolute mess, and it really is amazing to me what the Federal Army is able to do in Maryland despite all of that. That McClellan was able to turn them around so quickly, and that these guys are able to win 2 battles in a matter of 4 days and get Lee out of Maryland is just astounding to me. They're a little bit below all of this political mudslinging that's going on up above them, but they're certainly aware of it too. They know what's going on, and that these fighting soldiers can put all that together and literally rise up from the ashes of Second Manassas, and in just a couple of weeks put together a pretty damn good couple days of fighting in Western Maryland is really just amazing.
And playing a big role in that fighting in Western Maryland and those victories within 4 days of each other are a number of men from the Buckeye State, Ohio.
I knew Dan was going that way.
Before we do wrap up, I want to talk about your book that the two of you collaborate on, Ohio at Antietam. We're not going to get into the nitty gritty of the Antietam campaign itself, but I want to talk about your book just briefly. Where did the book come from, and why did you guys decide to put it together?
So also, the book came from Dan. It was Dan's idea. Dan approached me, so Dan, take it away.
Yeah, I was at a bookstore and in Gettysburg. I was at a bookstore in Gettysburg, and I saw a couple books. John Banks's Connecticut at Antietam, and there's another one I think was New Hampshire at Antietam. And I'm standing there and I'm thinking, well, by God, why is there not an Ohio at Antietam? And Kevin's understanding and mastery of the Maryland campaign. My understanding of Ohio's involvement, just because of of being a proud Buckeye. I thought it was a perfect marriage, and I approached Kevin and I said, why don't we talk about some of these Ohioans? And there's very popular stories of Ohioans, William McKinley and serving coffee at Antietam, which is really just the tip of the iceberg, to Rutherford B. Hayes at South Mountain. There's two future Ohio presidents that served in the Maryland campaign, to the Kanawha Division, which really, basks itself in glory at South Mountain, and even on the final moments of Antietam on September 17th. So Kevin was very gracious to join the project and really tell the story of these 11 Ohio units at South Mountain and in Antietam in book form.
How did the two of you work together to pull the book together?
A lot of long nights.
Yeah, it was difficult, not because I had to work with Dan, but I mean, we pulled the book together in the middle of COVID. Yeah. And that was, I think, the biggest hurdle that we found was, a lot of the research facilities that we needed to access were closed. And it maybe, they had staff working there still, and the staff with the facilities that we worked with were excellent. They were able to provide us materials that we needed in pretty quick time. Dan and I were pretty surprised, but, we couldn't go out and actually go to these places because they were closed to public use at the time because of COVID. So that was really difficult, but we had a lot of people working with us, both within History Press, our publisher, and within those different archival facilities that really helped us along the way, and we're understanding of that process. But it was a lot of long nights. Dan and I divided it up by chapter. So he covered certain units that fought at Antietam. I covered certain units that fought at Antietam. And it was fun to kind of merge the two writing styles and compare notes and compare some interpretations that we had, some different interpretations of what those units did at Antietam. So it was a lot of fun. Big learning process, but it was good.
It was, and it's by no means, for those of you that are interested in getting a copy, which I would encourage you to do, it's not the definitive account of every Ohioan or every Ohio unit that served at Antietam, but it highlights some of the roles that they played. I like to say that the Ohio units at Antietam and at South Mountain, they're like the Forrest Gump of the Maryland campaign. Every critical moment, at every critical place on every one of those battlefields, it's either an Ohio unit that's involved or a unit that's being led by a native Ohioan or Buckeye. So, one of the things we wanted to do was not tell the complete story, but to just highlight some of those, and also share stories that hadn't been published before, and visually as well. One of the things we sought to do was to find and publish a lot of images that had never been published before. We have some images of some officers in there that have never been seen before, tracked down some of the battle flags that were on the battlefields of South Mountain and Antietam. Those are included in there as well. So just a lot of really interesting stuff that folks can walk away with and say, hey, you know what? Ohio did contribute a lot during the Maryland campaign, and the monuments that they placed at Ohio Day on the fields of Antietam were definitely much needed to tell the larger story of the battle.
I did not know that the Maryland campaign was like a box of chocolates, but apparently
truly is. And they're Buckeye chocolates. That's peanut butter coated with chocolate casing if you're in Ohio and you love Buckeyes. So.
And how can readers get Ohio at Antietam?
Well, we would encourage you to head over to our publisher's website, History Press, or come out and hear one of our numerous talks. Both Kevin and I do a number of talks for roundtables and conferences and symposia and things like that. We have copies available. We would love to sign a copy for you and open your eyes up to the state that provided the third most number of troops to the Union War effort during the American Civil War, Ohio.
And come on out to Antietam, and you can pick it up in the Antietam bookstore as you tour the battlefield too.
Absolutely, and if you got the time, book a tour with Kevin. He'll take you to every single stop as a licensed Antietam battlefield guide out there that has some Ohioans. So.
Excellent. Dan, Kevin, thank you both for spending some time with me and talking a little bit about Pope, Porter, and politics. This has been a fascinating discussion.
Thanks
for having us.
So Dan Welch, Kevin Pawlak, I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We will see you online and on the battlefield.